1. Understanding trauma through a new lens. What's wrong with you? It's a question most people have heard, maybe even asked. But for someone who has experienced trauma, this question can deepen shame, reinforce judgment, and miss the root of the issue entirely. Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey invite us to flip the script, not to ask what's wrong, but what happened. This shift isn't just semantic. It changes the entire way we understand human behavior, pain, and healing. When a person acts out, withdraws, lashes out, or seems overly sensitive, it's easy to label them as difficult or dysfunctional. But behavior, especially disruptive or puzzling behavior, is often the language of unmet needs or unresolved pain. Dr. Perry, drawing from decades of neuroscience and clinical work, shows that our brains are shaped by experience, especially in childhood. Repeated stress or neglect early in life wires the brain for survival. That wiring can make people hypervigilant, reactive, or disconnected. What looks like defiance might be a nervous system stuck in survival mode. Oprah adds layers of personal insight to this scientific foundation. Her life story, one of hardship, abuse, and eventual healing, mirrors what the research reveals. Context is everything. Without knowing someone's history, it's impossible to understand their present. This is true whether you're a parent dealing with a defiant child, a teacher facing a disruptive student, or a friend confused by someone's distant behavior. Trauma isn't always about what happened once. Often, it's about what didn't happen, the absence of safety, love, or consistency. Understanding trauma also means acknowledging that healing doesn't come from shame or punishment, but from empathy and support. It asks for a new kind of curiosity, a compassionate curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why are you like this?" we ask, "What experiences shaped you?" This question opens the door to connection rather than condemnation. The science is clear. Experiences of neglect, abuse, and chronic stress change how the brain processes the world. But the good news is, connection can help repair those changes. When someone feels truly seen and safe, healing begins. And it often starts with just one person willing to ask the right question. What happened to you is an invitation, not to relive pain, but to understand it. And in understanding, we create space for growth, regulation, and eventually, peace. Point 2. The brain's response to stress and trauma. The brain is a living map of our experiences, shaped not just by genetics, but by what we've lived through, especially in our earliest years. When a child grows up in an environment of safety, affection, and predictable care, their brain develops along a path that supports learning, empathy, and resilience. But when early experiences are marked by fear, neglect, or chaos, that development shifts. To understand how trauma changes the brain, it helps to look at its architecture. The brain develops from the bottom up. The lower regions, like the brainstem, are responsible for survival functions, breathing, heart rate, and the fight-flight-freeze response. These areas develop first. Higher functions, language, reasoning, emotional regulation, reside in the cortex, which matures much later. If a child's early life is full of threat or stress, the lower brain systems become overactive. The brain essentially prioritizes survival over reflection. This is where the stress response system plays a central role. When we perceive a threat, our brain instantly triggers one of several survival modes: fight, flight, or freeze. In healthy individuals, this system activates briefly, then calms down when the danger passes. But for someone exposed to repeated trauma, such as domestic violence, emotional neglect, or community violence, the stress response system can become stuck in high gear. The brain becomes conditioned to overreact, even when the threat is no longer present. Consider a smoke alarm. Its job is to alert you when there's fire. But what if it's so sensitive that it goes off every time you toast bread? That's what happens in a brain sensitized by trauma. It constantly scans for danger, often misreading neutral cues as threatening. A raised voice, a sudden noise, or even a facial expression can feel like a life or death warning. These patterns don't just affect emotional responses. They influence attention, memory, and even physical health. A child who can't regulate their fear response may struggle in school, not because they lack intelligence, but because their brain is too preoccupied with staying safe to focus on learning. What makes this even more profound is that these patterns can persist into adulthood. A person might seem anxious, avoidant, or quick to anger, not because they choose to be, but because their brain was wired that way early on. The good news is that the brain remains plastic. With consistent, supportive experiences, it can change. But that process begins by recognizing that trauma isn't just stored in memories, it's wired into the brain itself. Understanding that is the first step to real healing. Point 3. The power of relationships in healing. When Monique was placed in foster care at age 6, she barely spoke. She avoided eye contact, flinched at sudden sounds, and refused to sleep without the lights on. Every caseworker noted the same thing. She was distant, disconnected, difficult to reach. But after being placed with a foster mother who simply showed up day after day, something began to shift. There were no grand breakthroughs, just quiet consistency. Breakfast together every morning. A gentle hand on the shoulder. Someone who didn't leave. Monique's story is not unusual. For children and adults alike, the path to healing from trauma does not begin with medication or therapy alone. It begins with people. Relationships are the most powerful regulators of stress and emotion. The brain's wiring, especially in early development, depends on interaction with safe, attentive caregivers. When that's missing, the nervous system becomes disorganized. But the good news is, what was shaped by experience can also be reshaped by experience. This is where the concept of relational poverty becomes vital. Just as economic poverty limits access to food, shelter, and education, relational poverty limits access to connection, trust, and emotional safety. A child growing up without stable adults, or an adult navigating life without meaningful support, lives in a state of chronic emotional starvation. And like physical hunger, that deprivation takes a toll. Dr. Perry emphasizes that healing is not about fixing someone. It's about building a web of safety, relationships where people feel seen, heard, and valued. The brain responds to pattern and repetition. When a person repeatedly experiences safe connection, their stress response begins to settle. Their body learns it's okay to relax. Their brain slowly starts to shift out of survival mode. This doesn't require perfection, only presence. A child who's been through chaos doesn't need extraordinary interventions. They need ordinary moments of reliability. A teacher who greets them each morning. A coach who listens. A grandparent who makes time. These relationships, layer by layer, rebuild what trauma tore down. For adults, too, healing often begins not in therapy rooms, but in friendships, mentorships, and community. The nervous system may not know how to trust at first, but with time and consistency, it can learn. The science is clear. Regulation happens through co-regulation, and co-regulation requires people. Healing is not a solo journey. It happens in connection, one relationship at a time. Point 4. Trauma's hidden impact on memory and behavior. When Jasmine was 9, she stopped speaking during math class. Her teacher thought she was being defiant or simply didn't want to participate. But what no one realized at the time was that the classroom's harsh fluorescent lights and a male teacher's raised voice had unknowingly triggered her body's memory of something she couldn't consciously recall, a traumatic experience from years earlier. She wasn't being difficult. Her brain was protecting her. To understand trauma's grip on behavior, we need to look at memory more closely. The brain stores experiences in two main ways: explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory includes facts and events we can consciously recall, names, birthdays, or what happened at a friend's house last weekend. Implicit memory, on the other hand, is unconscious. It's the body's memory, how it feels to ride a bike, the sensation of fear when a door slams, or the urge to flinch at a loud voice. Trauma often distorts both types of memory. In some cases, a person may vividly recall every detail of a traumatic event, replaying it endlessly. In others, memories are fragmented or entirely missing. This is not denial or avoidance. It's a neurobiological response. When the brain is overwhelmed by fear or pain, it shifts into survival mode. The areas responsible for storing coherent, time-stamped memories, particularly the hippocampus, may shut down, while emotional and sensory fragments are stored elsewhere. That's why trauma survivors might not remember what happened, but still react as if they're in danger. This mismatch between memory and response is what confuses so many survivors and those around them. They may overreact to small stresses, avoid situations they can't explain, or find themselves stuck in patterns they don't understand. These aren't personality flaws. They're survival adaptations. Behavior, then, becomes a clue, often the only visible evidence of a hidden wound. A child who lashes out, a teen who shuts down, an adult who avoids intimacy. These are often expressions of trauma encoded in the nervous system. The brain is trying to stay safe, even when the danger has long passed. Understanding this can shift how we respond to people. Instead of asking, "Why are you acting this way?" we can start asking, "What are you remembering?" Even if you don't know it, that shift opens the door to compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves. It acknowledges that behavior is not always about choice. Sometimes it's about history, and that history may live not in our words, but in our bodies. Point 5. The role of rhythm, regulation, and repetition. After months of unpredictable nights and emotional meltdowns, Mateo's foster mother began incorporating a simple routine into their evenings. Soft lullabies, gentle rocking in a chair, and a dimmed light that stayed on until he fell asleep. It wasn't immediate, but over time his restlessness eased. His body, once wired for chaos, began to trust the rhythm. The human brain is built to recognize and respond to pattern. Long before we speak or understand language, we attune to repetition, the heartbeat in the womb, the sway of being carried, the cadence of a lullaby. These rhythmic experiences help organize the developing brain, creating a sense of predictability and safety. For children who have experienced trauma, these patterns are often missing or disrupted. Their nervous systems adapt to inconsistency, becoming hyper-alert and reactive. But healing is possible, and it starts with rhythm. Dr. Perry emphasizes that patterned, repetitive activity, drumming, dancing, walking, singing, helps regulate the stress response system. It works not because it's complicated, but because it's consistent. These experiences activate the lower brain regions, where trauma lives, and gently reintroduce a sense of control and coherence. Neuroregulation through movement is especially powerful for children. A child swinging back and forth on a playground, bouncing on a trampoline, or engaging in rhythmic play is doing more than burning energy. They're rebalancing their internal state. Activities like yoga, rocking, or even rhythmic clapping tap into the body's natural ability to self-soothe. For adults, the same principle holds. A morning jog, steady breathing exercises, or listening to steady, calming music can signal safety to the nervous system. These activities help shift the brain out of a reactive state and into one that is more open to connection, learning, and reflection. Consistency is key. The brain thrives on what it can predict. Traumatized individuals often live in a state of internal disarray, unsure of what comes next. Repetition in caregiving, in environment, in relational cues sends a message: you are safe. Over time, this rewiring builds resilience. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's in the sway of a rocking chair, the beat of a familiar song, the quiet ritual of doing the same thing at the same time each day. In these small, rhythmic acts, the brain finds what trauma took away, a steady rhythm to hold on to. Point 6. Cultural and generational trauma. When Michelle visited the small town where her grandmother grew up, she expected stories of family, maybe a few old photos. What she didn't expect was the silence. Long pauses when certain names were mentioned, entire decades passed over without explanation. Slowly, she began to piece together what wasn't being said. forced displacement, segregation, and years of being made to feel invisible. It wasn't just family history. It was trauma, passed down through generations not by words, but by fear, tension, and silence. Cultural and generational trauma isn't always immediately visible. It's embedded in the nervous systems of individuals, but also in the collective fabric of communities. For many marginalized groups, Indigenous people, African Americans, Holocaust survivors, refugees, trauma didn't start with one person or one event. It was systemic, repeated, normalized. Entire generations grew up under chronic threat, discrimination, or displacement. And when trauma is this sustained, it doesn't just impact memory or mood, it shapes worldview. Children inherit more than just stories. They inherit nervous systems wired by their caregivers' survival strategies. A parent who lived through war may pass on hypervigilance. A grandparent who endured racism might teach their children to distrust institutions, not out of paranoia, but as protection. These patterns are adaptive in context. But when the original threat is gone and the behavior remains, it can feel confusing, even self-destructive, to those who never lived through the original trauma. That's why acknowledgement is so vital. Personal healing must be held within the wider truth of cultural history. When a community's pain is dismissed or denied, it reinforces the very trauma it's trying to move beyond. But when stories are told, honestly, openly, they give context, dignity, and meaning. Storytelling becomes an act of survival and resistance. Oprah speaks to this with deep personal resonance. Growing up in the South, she witnessed the generational echoes of slavery and segregation, the lack of opportunity, the pressure to stay silent. Through her platform, she's helped amplify voices that have long been silenced, showing that healing is not just personal, it's cultural. True healing involves more than therapy sessions or individual insight. It involves listening to the past, honoring it, and holding space for grief that may not have been named. It involves validating lived experiences that systems try to erase. And it begins with one essential truth. No pain, no history is too old to matter. Point 7. Recognizing and reshaping shame. When David spoke about his childhood, he avoided eye contact. He could describe being hit, yelled at, or ignored, but he always followed it with a disclaimer, but it wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. What he didn't say, and maybe didn't yet understand, was that beneath those memories lived a quiet, corrosive shame, the belief that he deserved the pain, or worse, that he had caused it. Shame is one of trauma's most persistent and invisible effects. It doesn't just whisper, "You did something wrong." It says, "You're something wrong." It's a story that buries itself deep in the mind and body, convincing someone that their worth is conditional, that if people really knew them, they'd leave. One of the most important distinctions in emotional healing is understanding the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I made a mistake." Shame says, "I am the mistake." Guilt can be a healthy guide for behavior. Shame, however, tends to silence, isolate, and damage. People stuck in shame may sabotage relationships, avoid help, or punish themselves in subtle or overt ways. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. Dr. Perry emphasizes that these feelings are not signs of brokenness. They are often survival responses. When children experience abuse, they can't afford to believe their caregivers are unsafe. It would threaten their survival. Instead, they internalize the blame. It's safer, in a tragic way, to believe something is wrong with me than to accept that the people you depend on are dangerous or absent. Breaking free from shame begins with awareness, recognizing the internal narrative that repeats unchallenged. Oprah often reflects on the power of naming these stories aloud, especially in safe, empathetic spaces. When pain is voiced without judgment, it begins to lose its grip. Reframing the self-narrative is not about pretending trauma didn't happen. It's about changing the meaning. Instead of "I'm unworthy," the new story might be "I survived something that wasn't my fault." This shift doesn't erase the past, but it changes how it lives in the present. Self-compassion is a skill, one that must be practiced. It means speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love. It means pausing when shame floods your system and reminding yourself, this feeling is old, but it's not true. With time, those small, intentional acts of kindness can become new patterns, ones that allow healing to take root where shame once lived. Point 8. The science of connection and co-regulation. Connection is not just emotional, it's biological. From the moment we're born, our nervous systems rely on others to feel safe. A newborn can't regulate its body temperature, heart rate, or emotions without help. The caregiver's voice, touch, and presence literally shape the infant's developing brain. This biological need for connection doesn't disappear with age. It simply matures, evolving into a lifelong drive for attunement. The feeling of being understood, seen, and emotionally aligned with another. At the core of healthy development is co-regulation. Before children can self-regulate, calm themselves down, manage stress, or focus, they need someone to do it with them. A calm adult becomes a kind of external nervous system. When a child is overwhelmed, the adult's regulated presence sends a signal. You're not alone, and you're safe. Over time, through repeated experiences, the child learns to internalize that calm. This is where therapeutic dosing becomes powerful. Dr. Perry uses the term to describe how small, frequent moments of connection have a cumulative effect. Just like medication, regulation doesn't need to be delivered in one large dose. A few minutes of genuine connection, eye contact, laughter, a shared moment, repeated consistently, can have a greater impact than a long but rare intervention. It's the rhythm and predictability of these moments that help repair the nervous system. Adults play a critical role in modeling regulation. A teacher who notices a child's escalating frustration and responds with calm presence, rather than reprimand, teaches that child how to return to center. A parent who acknowledges a tantrum without escalating themselves sends a message of emotional safety. These aren't just parenting techniques, they're neurological interventions. The metaphor often used is that of a tuning fork. When two tuning forks are placed close together, the vibration of one eventually causes the other to resonate at the same frequency. Humans work the same way. A regulated nervous system can help bring an overwhelmed one back into balance. But it works both ways. Dysregulation can spread just as easily. That's why self-awareness is so essential for caregivers, educators, and anyone in a helping role. Connection is not a soft skill. It's foundational to how brains develop, how healing happens, and how communities grow resilient. Regulation doesn't come from isolation. It comes from relationship. And in that steady, attuned presence of another, the body learns to trust again. The science of connection is at its heart the science of safety. Point 9. Supporting children and families with trauma histories. When Lena started kindergarten, she cried every morning, clung to her caregiver, and often hid under tables during group activities. Her teacher, Mr. Klein, could have labeled her as defiant or anxious. Instead, he paused, took a breath, and reminded himself, children show us what they've experienced, not just who they are. He started greeting Lena the same way every morning, a soft tone, eye contact, her favorite sticker ready on her desk. Within weeks, Lena stopped hiding. She began to smile. She even joined circle time. Children with trauma histories often don't respond to traditional discipline or praise in predictable ways. That's because their nervous systems have adapted to protect them from unpredictability, danger, or neglect. The behaviors we see, shutdown, aggression, disconnection, are not signs of poor character. They're survival strategies that once served a purpose. Supporting these children starts with presence. Not just physical presence, but emotional availability. A caregiver who shows up consistently, even in the face of rejection or withdrawal, communicates a powerful message. I'm not going anywhere. That reliability becomes a foundation for trust. Patience is the next essential ingredient. Progress is rarely linear. A child may seem to improve, then regress after a holiday, a loud noise, or a substitute teacher. Trauma has wired their systems to expect rupture. They may test boundaries not to be difficult, but to confirm whether the safety they feel is real or temporary. Adults who meet these tests with calm and compassion create a new kind of memory, one where safety lasts. Predictability matters more than perfection. Trauma often comes from chaos or inconsistency. Predictable routines, morning greetings, structured transitions, clearly explained rules, reduce anxiety. When children know what's coming next, they don't need to stay in a constant state of vigilance. They can begin to learn, connect, and grow. Creating trauma-informed environments doesn't require specialized equipment or clinical training. It requires empathy, flexibility, and a willingness to understand behavior as communication. A coach who notices a child isolating and invites them to help with equipment. A parent who builds bedtime rituals. A principal who trains staff to recognize signs of dysregulation instead of punishing it. These actions don't just manage behavior, they help heal brains. When caregivers respond to pain with curiosity instead of control, they offer more than support. They offer repair. They become part of the child's healing story. And in doing so, they help rewrite what safety, love, and resilience can look like. Point 10. Conclusion. Healing doesn't begin with a diagnosis. It begins with a question, asked not with judgment, but with compassion. What happened to you? This simple reframing, woven throughout the science and stories in what happened to you, invites a fundamental shift in how we see others and ourselves. Neuroscience has shown that our brains are shaped by experience. Therapy has taught us that connection repairs what trauma disrupts. And lived experience proves that healing is not only possible, it's deeply human. When we look at behavior through the lens of curiosity instead of blame, everything changes. A teen acting out is no longer trouble. They may be trying to protect themselves from a world that once hurt them. An adult avoiding closeness isn't cold or distant. They may have learned early that attachment comes with pain. Compassionate curiosity allows us to ask why, instead of assuming we already know. Oprah often speaks of the power of being seen, truly seen, without shame. That recognition, especially when offered in a moment of distress, is what allows healing to begin. Dr. Perry reinforces this with evidence from the brain. Safety and connection regulate the nervous system, and regulation opens the door to growth. This isn't abstract hope. It's biology. It's also a call to action. Healing is not linear, and it's not about erasing pain. It's about creating enough safety, consistency, and understanding that the pain no longer defines us. That work begins with self-awareness and continues through daily choices. To pause before reacting, to ask what someone might be carrying, to offer presence rather than correction. Some reflective questions to guide this process. When I encounter a difficult behavior, do I pause to ask what might be underneath it? How do my own past experiences shape the way I respond to others? Am I creating moments of connection, however small, in my relationships? Practices like journaling, mindfulness, listening without interruption, or simply naming emotions as they arise can help us stay grounded in this compassionate lens. No one heals in isolation, but healing also doesn't require grand interventions. It begins with a shift in perspective, one that turns reactivity into understanding and disconnection into care. The journey forward isn't about perfection. It's about presence, about returning again and again to the choice to be curious, kind, and brave enough to ask and really hear the stories behind the pain. That's where healing